Today we're going to revisit one of the most influential writers of the 20th century and ask ourselves how in the world she could possibly claim to know anything for sure. How do you know that you know anything for sure? This is a question you're going to want to ask yourself at some point in your life, so don't go away. We'll be right back to explore it. Over the last year or so, you've probably noticed that I end up complaining at the end of the show that I've run out of time, and sometimes I promise I'll come back and revisit the subject. And most of the time, that never really happens. But today it does, because today we're going back to the subject of Ayn Rand, the high priestess of atheistic individualism. And I guess I'm going to come back to her for a number of reasons. First of all, she was a bit of an influence in my younger years, as she is for a lot of college students who are trying to discover who or what they are. And so I guess I need to admit her influence and maybe talk about where I might agree with her and where I absolutely do not. Secondly, she wrote thousands and thousands of pages, and to try and address even a fraction of the issues in her philosophy with only like 30 minutes is something nobody can really do. Thirdly, and this is probably the biggest reason, it's really hard to deny Ayn Rand's considerable influence on modern Western culture. In fact, she's probably the biggest unnamed influencer of the 20th century. I mean, you'd be surprised at the number of well-known people who have admitted that she was a formative influence for them. Jimmy Wales, for example, the co-founder of Wikipedia, had a real liking for Ayn Rand. In a 2005 interview on C-SPAN, here's what he said. "But I think for me, one of the core things that is very applicable to my life today is the virtue of independence, is the vision, you know. If you know the idea of Howard Rourke, who is the architect in The Fountainhead, now that's an Ayn Rand book, who has a vision for what he wants to accomplish, and you know, there's some time in the book when he is frustrated in his career because people don't want to build the type of buildings he wants to build. And he's given a choice, a difficult choice, to compromise his integrity or to essentially go out of business. And he has to go and take a job working in a quarry. And for me, that model has a lot of resonance. When I think about what I'm doing and the way I'm doing is more important than any amount of money because it's my artistic work." So there you have it, one of the biggest internet innovators of the 21st century, and there's Ayn Rand right in the middle of it. And Jimmy Wales is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, this is probably going to be obvious, but a lot of conservative political pundits also lay claim to her influence, from Rush Limbaugh to Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity. She also appears to have influenced people like Penn Jillette, the magician and well-known skeptic, as well as a number of prominent CEOs like John Mackey of Whole Foods and Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, used to be one of Ayn Rand's close acquaintances. And Ronald Reagan's private letters also seem to indicate he'd been reading her books, even though Ayn Rand openly professed a deep hatred for Ronald Reagan. Some of you might remember that vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan was a fan of Ayn Rand, and apparently so is Clarence Thomas, that Supreme Court justice. Her influence in America runs deeper than most people suspect. And I will openly admit, as I already have, that some of her books were part of my own ideological development before I became a practicing Christian. And so today, because of her broad influence, I want to take the time to explore just a few more of her ideas and maybe compare them to a biblical worldview. Honestly, from where I sit, I still think she might have been right about some things. But I've come to the conclusion that she was right about those things for all the wrong reasons, if that makes any sense to you. It's entirely possible to come to the right conclusion without actually being right about how you got there. I mean, just witness the poor high school student who lands on the right answer in math class by accident. Ayn Rand was a keen student of human nature, and a lot of her observations were really quite astute. There's no question, for example, that people are deeply self-interested and people are motivated to protect and advance themselves. She's right about that. She's also quite right that a policy of nonviolence and voluntary mutual exchange are the best system we've come up with so far to keep our natural passions in check. But she gets to those conclusions by taking some rather unfortunate shortcuts and by leaving the possibility of a God completely out of the picture. And that's what I want to talk about. Ayn Rand was a little bit like the English philosopher John Locke, in that she advocated something known as tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is an idea that suggests that you and I come into this world knowing absolutely nothing. There is no innate human knowledge when you're born. It's almost like you've got a dial tone in your head. And our perceptions and understanding of the world come entirely from the data we collect through our senses. Here's the way that John Locke puts it in his famous work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. He writes, "All ideas come from sensation or reflection." In other words, everything you know comes through your senses. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, tabula rasa, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. So, in other words, in plain English, John Locke said that we enter this world knowing absolutely nothing. And then our senses begin to gather data about the world, and that data gets clumped together in categories in your brain so that you and I can start telling different things apart. So, from that perspective, the world is nothing but a big blur of colors and noise until your brain starts putting your perceptions of the world into organized categories so that, for example, you could tell your mother apart from an alarm clock. Then in time, you can start reflecting on what you've seen and develop theories about the nature of the world. Now, back in the 17th century when John Locke wrote this, it was such a novel concept that it was almost scandalous. Most people in his day assumed that human beings come into the world with inborn or innate knowledge, things you know the moment you're born, not the least of which, they would say, was a rudimentary knowledge of the existence of God. To suggest that your brain was completely empty at birth was a new idea that really upset the status quo. Of course, today that's hardly a novel concept, and the idea has been largely debunked since, but Ayn Rand persisted in using it. Here's what she said on the same subject. She wrote, "Chronologically, man's consciousness develops in 3 stages. The stage of sensations, the perceptual, the conceptual. Epistemologically, the base of all man's knowledge is the perceptual stage. As far as can be ascertained, an infant's sensory experience is undifferentiated chaos. Discriminated awareness begins on the level of precepts." Now, let me see if I can translate that. What she's saying is that human beings acquire knowledge in 3 distinct steps. First, you sense things with your senses, which is how your brain gathers data. Then your brain goes through the perceptual step where it perceives what it's looking at or listening to. Then it takes that information and sorts it into different categories so you can think about those things. That's the conceptual stage. And it seems to make some good sense, at least when you first look at it. But it does have a few serious problems, and I'll be right back to talk about those.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Epistemology is a $10 word for the philosophy of knowing, and it's really the basis of all other philosophy. How can you know that you know things for sure? How can we be sure that our perception of the world is accurate? If you can't solve that problem, you run the risk of having everything else you think about being completely wrong. For example, if you try to describe a moral and ethical lifestyle, you're going to get it completely wrong if you can't actually know anything for sure. For most people, murder appears to be wrong. We all seem to know that it is. How do you know that? How do you know that life is actually valuable, that there's something sacred about it? How can you know that violating someone else's right to life is actually wrong? What standard are you going to apply, and how do you know it's the right standard? This is a really sticky problem. Here's another question. How do you know you're not alone in the universe? I mean, you think you see other people? You think you're interacting with real people just like you, but how do you know that? How do you know that other people feel and experience the universe the same way that you do? This is a really important question, and if you can't solve the problem of knowing, there's nothing else you can study, at least not with certainty. This is perhaps the biggest problem in philosophy, and like any self-proclaimed philosopher, Ayn Rand took a stab at this question. She agreed with John Locke, and she said that you know nothing the day you're born and your senses begin to gather information about the world. Then your brain starts to sort through the information and it gives you the ability to contemplate it, think about it. It also gives you the ability to think about your own place in the universe and even contemplate the meaning of life. But there's a huge gap in her thinking. I mean, who in the world told your brain to do these things, and why does it do it? And how do you know your brain's doing a good job? We all know that our senses are notoriously unreliable. I mean, ask any lawyer or judge what happens during a trial and you'll see it. No two witnesses ever see the same thing exactly the same way. And how many times have you thought you saw something, maybe off in your peripheral vision, only to find out later you were wrong? Most of us are prone to seeing things that aren't really there. And we're especially prone to missing stuff that is there. I mean, think about all the time somebody suddenly says, "Hey, did you hear that?" And you didn't. Everybody else heard it, but you didn't. In his rather detailed critique of Ayn Rand, author John Robbins points out some of the flaws in her epistemology, the study of how you know things. And I'm going to admit, I'm pretty indebted to Mr. Robbins for a few of the things we're going to explore today. Here's what he says. Unfortunately for this schema, that's Ayn Rand's way of thinking, Rand failed to explain any of these stages satisfactorily. She claimed that at the conceptual level, the unit is not an arbitrary creation of consciousness, but she did not make the same assertion about the identity. She did not offer a solution to the problem of individuation, which is a problem of the first importance to the empiricist. By what data furnished by undifferentiated chaos does the mind identify individuals? What he's pointing out really is this. There are a lot of assumptions in Ayn Rand's way of thinking. If the mind is a blank slate the day you're born and there's nothing in it, how does it know how to start sorting out the information your eyes and ears receive? What standard is your brain going to apply when it differentiates between light and dark or red and yellow? And how in the world does your brain even know how to do these things? This is really a problem of consciousness, which is still one of the biggest problems that scientists and philosophers face. How did human beings become self-aware and self-reflective? How do our brains know how the world should be perceived? And what criteria are you going to use to interpret the data that your senses feed you? Ayn Rand talked a lot about using pure reason to understand the world, which is why her system of belief is called objectivism. And to a small extent, I can probably agree with her. I do think you can objectively assess the world and apply reason to it. But then how do you assess your own reasoning skills? How do you know you're any good at this? If human reason was a purely objective thing, then why do talented reasoning people come to such wildly different conclusions from each other? On the one hand, you've got Soviet planners in the 20th century who attempted to build a rational society based on empirical data and central planning. Then on the other hand, you've got philosophers of liberty like John Locke who pointed the Western world in a different direction. Which one of them's right? Whose rationality do you use? Pick up any two books written by any two philosophers and you get different conclusions. But everybody used their reason to get to those conclusions. So obviously, unaided human reason has some limits. And if you want to use your reasoning skills perfectly, you'd have to be omniscient. You'd literally have to know everything and anticipate every possible outcome, and no human being can do this. And the fact that two different reasonable people can look at the same object or incident or subject and see two different things, that should tell us something about the limits of human perception and reason. Personally, I think your senses and your capacity for reason are mostly reliable. They're not perfect, but you can mostly count on it most of the time. And the only way you can know this for sure is to have some kind of external standard by which you can judge your conclusions. For example, I can't tell you that my vision is accurate just because I think it is. That's like a drunk man insisting that he's fine to drive, something that happens all the time. But it happens because his senses are impaired, and he doesn't know he's impaired. So how do I know I'm not impaired all the time? To figure that out, I need a perfect external standard. And the biblical worldview puts that objective standard outside of me and places it with God. I mean, I can sense that murder is wrong, and I can develop a deep hatred for murder, but the only way I can know for sure that murder is wrong is to have an external objective standard that I can compare my thinking to. The reason I trust my senses is because the one who gave me the gift of vision and the gift of hearing tells me I can use my senses to gather actual wisdom. Here's how the book of Proverbs puts it. It says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding." You see it? The Bible insists you really can know things. And it tells us that we can reliably use our sense of hearing to accumulate wisdom and understanding. Proverbs 18 says it again. "The heart of the prudent acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." Now, of course, you still have to practice the art of discrimination, because not everything you perceive with your senses is going to be true. There are people who lie to you, and systems of belief out there that make no sense. So just the fact that you absorb some information doesn't mean you really know something valuable. You can't actually call it wisdom, not by yourself. All right, I got to take another short break, and then I'll be right back to share one really vivid example where Ayn Rand's faith in her own reason and senses really fell apart one day.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Barbara Brandon had a lot of reasons to really hate Ayn Rand, not the least of which was the fact that Ayn Rand and her husband Nathaniel were openly having an affair with each other. In fact, Ayn Rand and Nathaniel openly told their spouses they intended to cheat. So I guess you've got to take what Barbara wrote about Ayn Rand with a grain of salt, because she definitely had an axe to grind. But still, there's one incident she reports that blows apart Ayn Rand's belief that her reason, coupled with her senses, was all she needed to accurately perceive the world. She talks about a surgical procedure that Ayn Rand had to endure. And when Ayn Rand woke up, she found herself in excruciating pain. Here's the way Barbara describes what happened. One day, after Ayn had received a heavy dose of pain medication, she said that she could see the branches of a tree waving across the window pane. How could it reach so high when she was on the 9th floor, she asked, disturbed by this mystery. Joan realized she was seeing a reflection of the pole holding her intravenous equipment. She explained it to Ayn, adding that it was not uncommon to have mild hallucinatory experiences under heavy medication. Ayn Rand refused to believe it. She continued to insist that it was a tree. She knew it was a tree. A number of months later, Joan recalled, she called me in to discuss what she said was a serious matter. When I arrived, she shouted at me over the issue of the tree. How could I have tried to make her doubt her mind, she demanded. How could I have attempted to undermine her rationality? Ayn Rand was so devoted to the idea that you and I are perfectly rational with perfectly reliable brains and perfectly reliable senses that she actually refused to accept the fact that she'd been hallucinating. And from what I can tell, this episode was part of her descent into paranoia and what I consider to be at least partial madness. But there you have it. There clearly are cases where your senses are not reliable, and your interpretation of the world also becomes unreliable. And in that case, you need an external witness, an external baseline to help you make sure you've got things right. In the Bible's book of Psalms, there's an interesting passage where the author suggests that morally speaking, human beings have a massive tendency to get things wrong. The author is complaining about people who live wicked, immoral lives, and he suggests that these people are incapable of accurately assessing their own morality. Here's what he says beginning in Psalm 94, verse 4. They utter speech and speak insolent things. All the workers of iniquity boast in themselves. They break in pieces your people, O Lord, and afflict your heritage. They slay the widow and the stranger, and murder the fatherless, yet they say, the Lord does not see, nor does the God of Jacob understand. These people probably know at some level they're doing the wrong thing, but they refuse to believe that anybody's ever going to hold them accountable. That's why they say, the Lord does not see. It's because they're living as if there is no God and no external standard to which they're going to be held accountable. Now listen to the next few lines. It continues. Understand, you senseless among the people, and you fools, when will you be wise? He who planted the ear, shall he not hear? He who formed the eye, shall he not see? He who instructs the nations, shall he not correct? He who teaches man knowledge? The Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are futile. What the psalmist is saying is that the one who made our senses in the first place has a much better understanding of the universe than we do. By comparison to his thoughts, our thoughts are futile. Our senses lead us astray, and the fallen or broken nature of humanity leads us to misinterpret the evidence that our senses collect. Because of pride, something that Ayn Rand frankly had in spades, our logic convinces us that almost everything we do is right or justified. We might see the suffering we cause other people. We might see the damage we cause to the world around us, but our brains have this way of reinterpreting it all and giving us an entirely wrong, entirely selfish perspective. The psalm continues like this, and here comes the important part down in verse 12. Blessed is the man whom you instruct, O Lord, and teach out of your law. How does a rational human being prevent sliding into a foolish delusion? By comparing his or her thoughts against the thoughts of the one who created the human mind in the first place. We do have the ability to perceive the world accurately, and we do have the ability to accumulate wisdom and real understanding, but only when we cross-reference our findings with the ideas that come from the only truly objective mind in the universe. Okay, time for another short break so I can go and check my assumptions against a more enlightened standard, and then I'll be right back.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Well, look at that. I'm out of time again, and again, I've barely scratched the surface. And I know that because I'm saying these things here in the United States, a place that has been heavily influenced by Ayn Rand, I'm probably going to get a few letters telling me why I'm wrong. And I'm okay with that, just as long as you don't expect me to write back, because I just can't. Personally, I do think she was right about a few things, but again, for all the wrong reasons. The Bible, for example, does value individuality, and it does not give other human beings a license to commandeer your life. So in that regard, she does agree with the biblical worldview. But I guess I need to push back on the idea that human beings can be completely objective and rational all by themselves. If that was true, I wouldn't have a library with thousands of books written by rational, well-educated people who all disagree with each other. The more honest philosophers openly admit that real knowledge is hard to find when you are the standard by which you judge reality. And honest philosophers admit that the question of how we can know things for sure has never really been solved. For some philosophers, this was a really torturous question because not being able to know things for sure is an awful way to live, especially if you're prone to overthinking like I am. This state of uncertainty is something that Paul actually described in a letter to Timothy 2,000 years ago. He described the way human beings were going to be living in the very distant future, and he gets it remarkably right. He says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. From such people turn away." This, what he's describing, is a generation that lives completely for self. They're essentially hedonists, living for pleasure, which is where some of the disciples of Ayn Rand seem to end up. Then Paul says this in verse 7, which I find really interesting. He says these people are always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. That's a pretty good description of unaided human reason. Over the last couple of centuries, philosophers seem to have come to the conclusion that there is very little in this universe that you and I can know for sure. And these are very intelligent, well-educated people, but they're always learning and never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. But what if there is truth? What if there is somewhere solid to stand? What if the claims of this book, the Bible, really are true? What if there is an external objective standard by which you can compare your own observations and know whether or not you're even close to being right? What if you could know things for sure? The Bible is a book that most of you have easy access to, yet it's probably the most neglected book in the world. I mean, you might still disagree with me when you read the Bible, but at least you ought to be giving it a chance, because I'm guessing that when you read it, you're going to get the sense that there is something real out there and there's something real in here. I mean, yes, when you read it, some of the claims in here are going to make you squirm. But then you should probably ask yourself why you're squirming. And if you want, we'll help you get free study materials to get you started in reading this book. Just go to BibleStudies.com. Look, I've read the likes of Ayn Rand, and I can admit where she's right, even though it's a school of thought I can no longer accept. And I guess today I'm daring you to do the same thing with the Bible. Read it. You might just find an authentic way to experience the world around you. I'm Shawn Boonstra. Thanks for watching.